Welcome back to another exciting episode of the Prevention Leaders Podcast. I am your host, Dave Clausen, and today we have a special guest who is a true titan in the field of prevention, my longtime friend and colleague, Rich Lucey. Now, Rich and I have shared the mic on his podcast a couple times, actually, but this is the first time he's joining us here, and I couldn't be more thrilled and grateful. Rich brings over 3 decades, yes, 3 decades of experience at both state and federal government levels, working tirelessly to prevent alcohol and drug use among youth and young adults, especially college students. Currently, Rich serves as a Senior Prevention Program Manager in the Drug Enforcement Administration's Community Outreach and Prevention Support Section. In this role, he plans and executes educational and public information programs, evaluates program goals and outcomes, and serves as an advisor to the section chief and other DEA officials on drug misuse prevention and education programs. Today, we're diving into some truly engaging topics that are sure to resonate with anyone passionate about prevention. First, we'll kick things off by exploring Rich's winding journey into the prevention field. From his early days as a theater major dreaming of Broadway to becoming a national point person for prevention. We'll also delve into the strategic prevention framework and discuss why prevention is not random. Rich will share his insights on the importance of having a strategic plan in place and how this guides effective prevention efforts. Plus, we'll unpack the 5 essential strategies for maintaining prevention success during times of disruption, such as leveraging partnerships and staying flexible. And if you think that's all, we're just getting started. Rich will also shed light on evolving challenges in the prevention landscape, including critical issues of fake pills and illicit fentanyl, and why it's vital for prevention professionals to stay informed and proactive. But wait, that's not all. We'll also be sharing some powerful anecdotes, practical advice, even a bit of humor, surprise, as we navigate through these important discussions. So whether you're a seasoned prevention professional or just starting out, this episode is packed with insights and takeaways you won't want to miss. So without further ado, let's dive in. In prevention, we are all leaders. Whether you're leading a nationwide prevention initiative, facilitating statewide prevention community, you're a coalition coordinator, or a one-person shop, you are a prevention leader. How we show up and how we engage with others to create positive change takes all types of leadership. So sit back and enjoy these conversations with your fellow prevention leaders from across the globe who are sharing their lessons learned, best practices, and strategies for success.
Are you ready to transform your leadership approach? Do you want to move from just managing tasks to inspiring and connecting with your team on a deeper level? Then the Prevention Leaders Masterclass is for you. Join Angie and Dave, experienced coaches and facilitators, in a transformative journey of personal growth and authentic leadership. Their masterclass is designed specifically for prevention professionals who are eager to unlock their potential and lead with innovation and empathy. In this masterclass, you will discover your personality and how it influences your interactions as a leader, and unleash your potential to become the best version of yourself. You will also deepen your understanding of others by learning the art of facilitative and coaching leadership to inspire your team to work more effectively and efficiently. You'll get practical tools and processes to engage your community as a facilitative leader. Don't miss out on this opportunity to foster connections, ignite self-understanding, and shape the change you want to see in yourself and the world. Limited cohort sizes ensure full engagement and a personalized learning experience. Our next cohort begins in August. Sign up today and embark on a journey that will transform your leadership and make a meaningful impact in your community. Visit the link in the show notes to register today.
All right, podcast listeners, we're back for another episode, and as we were planning this episode, I was a little surprised that I'd not had the opportunity to chat with my longtime friend and colleague, Rich Lucey, who's here. I've been on his podcast a couple different times, but we never made it happen here. And so, y'all, I'm excited to finally make this come together. So without further ado, welcome, Rich. It's good to see you as always.
Thank you, Dave. I'm really excited to be here. And yeah, I think the score is 2-1 now. It's I think you've been on twice, and now, here I am. And I'm just thrilled to do it. You and I, we talk prevention offline and in professional events and stuff. And I think the listeners and the viewers are in for a treat with two passionate prevention people talking.
Prevention is in our bones. It's in our blood. It's in our souls. Yes, indeed. And so, but you got me thinking 2-1. So if we record long enough and I cut this recording into 2, does that even the score?
I don't know. Now you sound like you're doing the Wicked movie. They're going to do 2 parts to that.
Right. Oh, goodness. Well, I think you know how I like to start most of my episodes with hearing sort of your journey to prevention or to your current role. And so I was wondering if you might give us a little history, a journey.
Yeah. Well, just like almost everybody else in this field, nobody really takes a straight line into the prevention field. I've noticed over the course of my 30 plus years in this field, and I'm no different. It was a winding road. People that know me, will notice the pop culture references drop now and again. I've already done one, on this podcast. I was a theater major in college. That was, my dream was I was going to end up on Broadway. That was where I was headed. And then I graduated and I realized, now you got to make a living. So the elevator speech is this. I started working in the mailroom of the New York State Department of Social Services, and I was there for 1.5 years. I saw a job announcement come across as I was sorting mail to be a secretary for the New York State Division of Alcohol Abuse and Alcoholism. I applied for it and I got it. So I went from being a mailroom to being a secretary. It was in the Prevention Bureau of that agency. I was the secretary to the Director of Communications. And as such, every publication, every fact sheet, every planning guide that went out to the field in New York State came across her desk and ultimately my keyboard. So I read everything. And that's really how I self-taught myself early on in the prevention space. And then from there, the opportunity to be the point person for that agency's higher education initiatives came along. I applied for it and I got it. And I was working for Fran Harding there in the Prevention Bureau for about 8 years. And then I jumped to DC, started my federal career. And that's how I got to where I am here. I went from Department of Ed for 9 years. Then I was Fran's special assistant at CSAP for 8 years. And then Sean Ferns, who's the section chief of where I work right now, recruited me to come working here. Unbeknownst to me at the time, it was because DEA really wanted to build up their portfolio of prevention resources for colleges and universities. And he knew my work, mainly through collaboration between CSAP and DEA. And that's how I ended up where I am. So never in my wildest dreams did I think I'd get from performing on stage in the college environment to, and I make this analogy all the time, I'm on a different kind of stage now. And never did I think I would be a national point person. Sometimes I hate to use the word expert, but sometimes you own it, right? In this field. I never would have imagined that, but took a lot of time and hard work, and here I am.
I can relate in the aspect that I didn't even know prevention was a field. I didn't know it was a thing.
Right.
So of course I didn't dream about it or plan for it, but somehow I found my way and just where I was meant to be. Yeah.
Yeah, I think we've talked about that with your experience in the military. And your early college experience and then the military and where you how you came out of that experience, and then campus law enforcement. Again, I don't think anybody's journey into, as I said, into prevention is a straight line.
Yep, absolutely. I can still reflect back to the day I stepped into Dr. Eric Davidson's office, and this was when I was the crime prevention officer, and I was just trying to kind of get the lay of the land and see what was going on and where could I get involved. And he started talking about prevention science and evidence-based prevention, and I was like, wait, what? That's a thing? Okay. Let's go. Let's do more of that. Let's dial that up. Yes. Yes, indeed. And to kind of segue, because I want to jump right into it, but that, it may sound like our paths to prevention may be a little random, little wandering and not strategic, not planned necessarily. But that brings me to one of my favorite quotes of yours, and that it is, prevention is not random. And I want to just kind of talk about that a little bit. So what is your sort of backstory on that quote?
So it's the strategic prevention framework, and we can call it the SPIF from here on out. It's having a strategic planning process, and that is what will guide you. And I get concerned when I hear about folks who are haphazardly doing prevention. I think the majority of people are not. I think the majority of folks in our field, whether they're on a college campus, in the military, in the workplace, in K-12, in the community at large, I think the vast majority of prevention professionals are doing prevention strategically, or as I also say, intentionally and purposefully. But we also know there are a lot of people now working in prevention. They've kind of been thrust into this role. It's one of, when I first started in my career, we had the luxury of a person on campus being, they would often be nicknamed the alcohol person, right? But ultimately what they meant was they were the prevention person. And that was pretty much full time what they focused on. And now it's probably the third, at least, hat that they're wearing. And so when I do my presentations and I do podcasts like this, I want to emphasize and re-emphasize for people that in order to get the results you're hoping for, you have to have a strategic plan in place. You can't, that's where prevention is not random came from. It just, you'll not get what you're looking for. And so that's kind of where it bore out of, and it's probably one or so of the 4 or 5 sound bites or quotes that I usually will drop in my presentations. And maybe I have to have a t-shirt. I know you're big on t-shirts, right? We got to get that on a t-shirt somewhere.
Yeah, it's got to have some swag. And taking us down a little tangent, little rabbit hole, which I guess I can because it's my podcast.
Absolutely.
Big thing behind the t-shirt is that's just sort of one small step that in my mind is helping foster and nurture that culture of togetherness in the prevention field. And just every little chance I get driving home, prevention's better together, just to try to create a ripple effect in the field. And t-shirt's just a fun way to do it.
Well, and the sound bites, they may seem pithy and cute and such when we say them, but people latch onto them because they really end up being guideposts for folks. Prevention is not random. It's totally anchored in the strategic prevention framework. And as we'll probably talk about in a bit, that can fill up, 4 or 5 different podcasts episodes, each step and such. So I don't want to say you boil it down to this cute little saying, but ultimately that's what it does come down to. Prevention's not random.
Absolutely. Until we make that SPIF podcast series, y'all have a YouTube video series that walks through each step of the SPIF. Am I remembering correctly?
I'm glad you brought that up, because on campusdrugprevention.gov, which people hopefully have visited, and if not, they're about to, our one-stop shop of all resources that are primarily prevention related to all drugs. We've created the Prevention Guide page, and as part of the Prevention with Purpose series that we've more or less branded, we did a web series. Oh God, it was during the pandemic. I think it was a year in, and we were all scrambling, figuring out how we were going to go virtual. I mean, you take a look at it, it almost belongs in the museum. In terms of like what we had to work with, we weren't dealing with, I mean, I'm sitting in our AV studio. I'm very fortunate. I know you're in your podcast studio. But 3 years ago, a lot of people didn't have ring lights. A lot of people had the kids yelling in the background, and, our pets are in the background, which I'm still in favor of, by the way.
Always.
Always. But we did that web series as these 4-minute snippets from folks around the country, friends and colleagues of yours and mine alike, Peggy Glider, Dolores Cimini, Diane Fedorchak, just for example. And they each spoke about one step of the spiff and what it meant to them and how they've worked with it. It's probably time for us to update that series. And I, welcome the opportunity to do that at some point. There's just only so many hours in the day, as we know. But yeah, I'm glad you brought that up, because we continue to try to figure out what are the resources that people need to help support them in their work. And the development of that web series was each step of the spiff in little bite-sized chunks. And now we're going to name drop all throughout this episode. I will name drop Joan Masters right here. Love Joan to death. And when I latch on to quotes from people, she and I have talked about how it can feel overwhelming to do this work and to think of all I have to do with the 5 steps and the cultural competence and humility and sustainability. And she says, do it incrementally. You can do strategic planning incrementally, which then feels a lot more manageable. So that's sort of how the video series came about, was to put it in kind of little bite-sized pieces for people.
I've got a couple nuggets or quotes from Joan as well that I've grabbed and held on to as well, which I'm sure I'll bring up. At least one of them I know a little bit later on too. Oh man, I've learned so much from working with Joan. But okay, so the pandemic, we talked about that just a little bit, and being strategic, having a strategic plan, and then boom.
Yep.
Life, the world, weather, funding, pandemic, something throws you a major curveball and derails your plan. And it happens more frequently than we may care to admit. And I always like to just bring up the fun. I believe it's a Mike Tyson quote where everybody has a plan until they get punched in the mouth or punched in the face, right? Like, we did this strategic planning. We followed the spiff, and then boom. Yeah. Something happened and derailed. How can we still be purposeful in our prevention? How can we be strategic then? What do we do?
Yeah. Of course, I'm going to talk about the Strategic Planning Guide, Prevention with Purpose. When the idea for that guide came about, which came from you and about 14, 15, 16 other people like you around the country, I've learned in my career, one of the tenets of prevention is local people solve local problems. People will support what they help to create. And when we try our best not to develop resources in a vacuum. And so when I have conversations at conferences, by email, in podcasts, just on the phone about what's missing, like what gap can we fill? And the first thing we heard was the website. That's how that got created. We filled that gap. And then the next one was publications from the former Higher Ed Center, from my day when I was there at Department of Ed, up until now. None of them have been updated. The compliance guide on complying with Part 86 regulations from Department of Ed, experiences in effective prevention, that hadn't been updated. And so we set about developing that strategic planning guide, and I kept coming back to the SPIF. I said, you know what? There's nothing like it out there that couples the SPIF with prevention programming on college campuses. And so that's how that came about. And we published it in January 2020 at the NASPA Strategies Conference in New Orleans. And none of us knew. And it was wildly well received. I mean, we expected it to be well received, but the reaction that we got and the response went beyond our expectations. And then 2 months later, March 16th, 2020, who would have, if you were watching the news, we heard about this virus that was happening in China. We heard about it. And then we heard it was migrating. And then we heard it was likely going to hit the US. None of us knew that, when we published Prevention with Purpose in January 2020, all of our worlds were going to turn upside down just a short, 10 weeks later. And this year, actually it was last year when we started working on the revision, we had decided it was about time. It'd been 3.5 years since it was developed. And we knew it needed to be updated because of what happened, that big, huge disruption called COVID. And so as we set about revising the guide, and I am going to shout out Aaron Ficker and the entire team at EDC, who worked on not only the first guide, but then also the second one. So we had multiple conversations. Initially, I thought it was going to be a chapter about prevention in a post-COVID world. That was initially my vision. Mm-hmm. And as we talked about it, we said, yeah, but you know what? As soon as we start talking about solely COVID, we anchor this in a 2.5 year period. And we didn't want to do that. We wanted it to be a bit evergreen, obviously. And so we started talking about this issue about disruption more broadly. And so again, kudos to Aaron and the team. That's how we ultimately defined disruption as any type of event that disrupts the learning environment. Now, I'd known a little bit about this from my days working in the Office of Safe and Drug-Free Schools at the U.S. Department of Education. And unfortunately, and we are still dealing with this god-awful issue now, and I'll just be strong in my passion about this at times, one of the biggest disruptors that has happened in K-12 at that time were school shootings. Disrupting the learning environment, right? And so trying to determine what are strategies that can help during those periods of disruption. And so, I was hearkening back to those days when we were trying to define disruption here. So it was any type of a disruption to the learning environment. So that opened things up to us. It was an outbreak of disease or a virus of some kind. So sure, COVID-19 was on top of a lot of people's minds, but so was meningitis outbreaks. And unfortunately, I've just recently read CNN had a news story that measles outbreaks has been happening lately when we thought we had eradicated it several years ago. So you've got disease, you've got on-campus tragedies, you've got severe weather. Our good friend Allison Smith, and she and I chuckle almost every time she and I go to do some type of an event down on the Gulf Coast, along comes Hurricane Huziwatsi. I mean, it's so you got that. You got transitions in leadership. That can be disruptive. And then you also have cuts in service. And we know prevention is one of the first things on the chopping block when people are looking to scale back resources because budgets are tight and such. So that's how disruption, that's how this chapter came about. It evolved from focusing solely on this disruption of COVID, but much more broader. What affects or interrupts the learning environment? And that's where we landed on this chapter.
Yeah, you never know what disruption is coming your way. And I'm just reflecting. So I was the director of the Mid-America PETTC during the pandemic, and I had, a little over a year under my belt when the pandemic started, and leading the center, the region through all that. And I had my approach to it, and I can weave some of the thoughts through, but I'm curious, in the chapter in Prevention with Purpose on disruptions, I know you outlined 5 strategies. So there's 5 steps of the spiff. There's 5 strategies. Coincidence?
A little bit. I mean, I think that, again, with all due credit to Aaron and the team, it needed to feel practical. It needed to, we wanted people to come away with something. We didn't want it to just be about a chapter about disruption. We wanted it to be about how can you either maintain prevention or achieve prevention success during disruptions. And through the interviews that they did with multiple people on campuses all around the country, what ended up shaking out were these 5 different strategies. And eureka, there were the takeaways. And that's how, again, you could do an episode on each one of the takeaways. But we wanted to ensure that people had, again, we come back to these guardrails. What can help guide people in the work that they're doing? And so the whole Prevention with Purpose guide are those guardrails, but so are these 5 strategies within this one chapter. They're also a roadmap for people.
Yes, indeed. And let's talk about them a little bit. Just touch on them because, we don't want to spoil the teaser for when we do a 5-part series on each one. Right. But the first one being stay strategic. So we talked about prevention is not random, must be purposeful, using the spiff, being strategic when there's not a disruption. How do you stay strategic, or what tips do you have for folks to stay strategic during or in the wake of a disruption?
That first strategy is stay strategic. It seems so simple and intuitive, and it should be. Anytime I'm doing a presentation or anytime I'm doing a podcast and talking about the strategic prevention framework, we say there are only 5 steps, but it's not that simple. Each step is complex and takes a lot of hard work. But that first issue, we wanted to come back to, and Erin, I'll drop her quote because I've now stolen this. One of her quotes is, "The beauty of the spiff is the spiff." And we know it's transferable to so many other different issues. People use the spiff if they're dealing with suicide prevention, if they're dealing with teen pregnancy prevention, violence prevention. We know that, and people use it in their daily lives. I mean, we know plenty of people who, have become that anchored in this process. And a disruption shouldn't derail your prevention program. Will it make it bumpy? Absolutely. I mean, that's the very meaning of a disruption. But we know from folks who have embraced the spiff and adhered to a strategic planning process, that evolving landscape or changing priorities, that's another, we talked about transitions in leadership. Still having the very basics of your strategic prevention framework, your plan for your campus, that's we've called it your true north. That is your compass. That's what's going to help guide you and have the conversations with the people that you're going to have on campus and in the community, regardless, again, of what the disruption is. One of the other strategies is be flexible and be creative. We know that flexibility is one of the hallmarks of prevention. Now, we all were forced into being flexible from, during the pandemic. It forced us to be. But, how many times have people planned a conference? We're talking before the pandemic. And I'll talk about the Northeast, where I'm originally from, in New York. You plan a conference anytime between November and April, you're risking a snowstorm coming through. And what happens? A snowstorm happens during a conference you're going to have on campus, or a big prevention fair you got going that day. That's what prevention people do. They figure it out in how they're going to adjust, how they're going to pivot. Pivot was never a word. That never was a buzzword prior to really March of 2020, right? But we had to figure out how to pivot prevention. And so that's why, the book ends, and there are 5 of them. They don't have to be done in order. They're not really in order of priority, but kind of are. In terms of number 1 is stay strategic. And number 5, be flexible and be creative.
And so my strategic approach for the PTTC, the way I like to kind of half-heartedly joke, but also kind of serious, in that we were preparing for the pandemic way back in November of 2018 when I first started. And that my strategy was centered around the why that we had created for our region, and that was to create a culture of community so that we could come together to support each other. And the backstory on that was, I live in Indiana, but I serve Missouri, Iowa, Nebraska, and Kansas, states away. And I said, I want to work myself out of a job. I want to, sustainability to be with the region, the people in the region. And so really wanted to create any opportunity for folks from across the state, across the region, to connect, to build relationships, to nurture relationships, to spark collaboration, and that's what was going to help the region be successful and sustainable. And little did I know that, boom, the pandemic happened. Okay, guess what? That true north of still, let's create that culture of togetherness so we can help each other out. And that positioned us a lot better than some to be able to navigate and be flexible during the pandemic as well. Yeah.
I mean, you think of the early part of the pandemic, Dave, mid-March through June, July,
Mm-hmm.
we were all basically, for the most part, all hunkered down. And there was the keeping 6 feet apart and staying at home. Nobody was going out. But then in, the fall of 2021, campuses started to open back up again. And, slowly we've navigated back to what was familiar. And I think, to your point, coming back in 2021 in that fall period, as we started to come back together, we really relied on those partnerships, those relationships that we had developed a year, 2 years ago. Like you said, we had been preparing for it. We just didn't know then. And that's why we talk about another strategy in the chapter around existing, leverage those partnerships that you have. And one of the things I talk about when building partnerships, again, and I know it sounds like being a broken record, but it's why it's so important. You also have to be strategic in your partnerships, because people are going to ask you, and you have to be prepared to answer, why am I at the table? What is it you need me here for? And you have to be able to answer that question. It's like, what's in it for me? There's still that question people are going to have. Why do you need me at this table talking about, preventing drug use among college students? I'm a business owner in the community, or the sheriff's office within the county, or even academic affairs on a campus. They might all ask that question, what am I doing here? And so be strategic in who you're asking and why you're asking them to be part of your efforts. So leveraging those existing partnerships also will really be beneficial if and when a disruption occurs.
Hey folks, just a quick break to tell you about an exciting collaboration between the Prevention Leaders podcast and Wired Biohealth. Wired Biohealth has crafted a special package just for our listeners interested in exploring the genetic basis behind their behavioral health. This offer includes 50% off of their epigenetic kit, free shipping in the US, a complimentary virtual review of your biomarker evaluation report with a Wired Biohealth consultant, and a free 60-minute follow-up session. Now imagine gaining personalized insights from a simple cheek swab that empowers you to make informed decisions about your wellness. Now, I know I've mentioned on past episodes about my journey with them over the last year, and y'all, it has been a game changer in all aspects of my life. So I invite you to check out wiredbiohealth.com and mention my name, Dave Clausen, to grab this exclusive deal for you all, the listeners of the Prevention Leaders Podcast. Now, let's get back to our episode. So, partnerships, prevention being better together. And I shared my why approach, the PTTC, and as I read through the disruption chapter and looked at these strategies, it was cool to see how these were all woven through sort of my mindset, my approach as well. And, partnerships, finding those go-getters. That was my mind, and building that sense of togetherness. And actually Joan Masters there in the region as well. I know she's a advocate for assessment, and that being, strategy 2. What's sort of the backstory on that one as it relates to disruptions?
So, if we look at us having a strategic plan is the foundation, that's, assessment being the first step of the SPIF. I don't like to say that any one is more important than the other of the 5 steps, but unless and until you know what you're working with, you don't know what to focus on. And that's the beauty of assessment, and why, the sound bites that I use is data drives programming. Having the data in hand. And what we learned as the updated guide was being developed, and this chapter specifically, is that during the interviews that Erin and her team did, those campuses that had this culture of assessment, that's where the phrase came about, that really had assessment truly embedded in their work. They were used to doing surveys. There wasn't survey fatigue. They were being strategic, again, in the types of assessments and the timing of the assessments and such. But those campuses that embraced assessment and had a culture of assessment were able to successfully navigate during a disruptive period. They either were able to tie their findings to what was going on and I'll use COVID as the example. I know Dolores Cimini up at the University at Albany. Go Danes. I know that's my full disclosure, alma mater. But Dolores had one of the early survey findings that came out, tying what was going on campus to what was going on with COVID. And what they had found initially on campus was those students who were likely to not follow public health guidelines, wearing the mask, the social distancing, getting vaccinated, those students were also more likely to be binge drinkers or to use other drugs. They used those findings to help them pivot and, again, be flexible, be creative in where they needed to then perhaps target some of their programming. So having that, again, that's where that culture of assessment came into play, was those campuses that have embraced data collection and assessment, that has actually helped them during these times of disruption. I'll use a non-COVID example. It was Hurricane Florence came up and came through, and Wilmington was kind of the bullseye when that hurricane had hit. And they had started seeing some different trends in drug use. And this is why the disruption piece really, why we felt it was so important. We know from research, we've known this for years, that drug use, and when I say drug use for our viewers, I'm lumping alcohol into that. So sometimes I'll say alcohol and other drug use, sometimes I'll just say alcohol and drug use, or I'll just say drug use. It's all in one as far as I'm concerned. We know it tends to go up following a traumatic event or during stressful times. And so we think about these, outbreak of disease and on-campus tragedies, severe weather. All of these can be stressful and traumatic. And so what Katrin saw among the students there at UNCW in Wilmington, they were looking at marijuana use tend to tick upward. And so again, it just gave them that snapshot that, oh, this is something we probably need to keep an eye on. And then they'll see the downtick, right? So you'll see the uptick, but that's the beauty of the data. That's the beauty of that culture of assessment. So those are just a couple of examples of what, people that I know who embrace assessment and data collection and how they used it during times of disruption.
I just love the fact that the word culture is being woven throughout. I've got a little training that I do that titled Culture is the Strategy. And if we look to think about and be intentional about what is our current culture and how are we shaping, fostering, nurturing, influencing the culture? Is it, are we being intentional about it? Because culture is always changing. And if you're not intentional about it, you're at its whim.
We've known that on college campuses. I mean, using the very broadest sense of the word culture, that the culture shifts on a college campus every year with that influx of first-year students and that outflux of the graduating seniors, right? So that's why we know over time, talking to folks who work on and around college campuses, that's why it's so important to look at not even the data of their own students. Look at the monitoring the future data of the 8th, 10th, 12th graders, specifically those 12th graders. Not all of them are coming to campus, but a good chunk of them are. And so what are the trends? What are the data showing us among the 12th graders? Because a large number of them are coming to campus. It's going to give you another potential, harbinger of what's to come. And that's why it's important to look at all those different types of data sources. But to your point on culture, yeah, in its most broadest sense, we know it's constantly shifting in the college environment.
And there's one of the strategies left we haven't touched on. So we got stay strategic, commit to assessment, leverage existing partnerships, be flexible and creative. But we haven't talked about, which is actually the fourth one in the chapter.
Yeah.
Get close to leadership.
Yeah.
Tell me more about that.
That's difficult. I've not worked on a college campus, and I'm very upfront about people, and yet here I am talking about preventing drug use in that particular setting. I like to think that one of the reasons that I've related so well with people like yourself and all of our colleagues around the country is working in state government and federal government, which has been my entire career. That hierarchy, that bureaucracy is really not very different than the hierarchies and the bureaucracies that exist on college campuses. And so I can empathize with folks that they can't get close to their college president, right? I couldn't necessarily get close to the commissioner of an agency I worked for, or the administrator of an agency that I worked for. So you have to figure out, leadership comes in many forms. It doesn't have to be the top leadership. We know leaders come in the form of VPs for student affairs, academic affairs, a faculty member, peer educators, right? When we talked about disruption, you think about college and university campuses, and you think about emergency operations plans and crisis management. That came up during the conversations, and that's why I write a little bit about it, is getting to know who your emergency management point of contact is on your campus and get to build a relationship there. That might mean over a cup of coffee or in the student union over lunch or something to that effect. See if there are places for common goals and common mission and such. So that when and if that disruption, whatever it is, comes about, now you've got that, you've got that relationship. It may not have anything necessarily to do with the work you're doing in prevention per se, but what I just got done saying, we know from disruptions, drug use tends to go up during those times and following those times. I think having that relationship with the person who's shepherding the campus's emergency management and crisis management plans can only be beneficial. So, we wanted to also drive home the point that prevention needs to be, it may not be the absolute forefront, but it cannot be, I've used this analogy before about the stove. Prevention often gets put on the back burner at times during times of crisis, and I get it. It should never be taken completely off the stove. And so being connected with the leaders on the campus, whomever you determine those allies and champions are, I think really can do nothing but help bolster and keep prevention at least on people's radar screens. Again, it may not be at the forefront, but high profile suicide on a campus, God forbid a shooting on campus, tornado comes through nearby or on campus. Again, you've got your emergency management plans going on, but you also, with your strategic plan, need to figure out how you're going to provide the programming you need to in order to keep that alcohol and other drug use, not going up. So getting close to leadership, that's where we were coming from with that, was really to continue to keep prevention somewhere on the radar screen. It doesn't have to be right in the center, but at least keep it on the radar screen.
I also heard kind of elements woven throughout there that when you're getting close to leadership, especially in times of disruption, and this is my own interpretation in words, is don't necessarily lead with an ask. And I reflect back to actually sort of name dropping on this episode, Trent Coffey from Scott County, Tennessee, when he talks about doing prevention in rural Tennessee, it's, go to your community leaders and help relieve burdens. What can I help you with? What can I take off of your plate?
Yep.
And then that will help you have the prevention conversations when the time is right and create those partnerships and collaborations, but seek to help with burdens, relieve burdens for folks. And I'm just connecting that to campus leadership. They got a lot going on, especially in time of disruption. So how can I help?
I throughout my career, I've heard frustrations from folks working on campus who say, I can't get the president to focus on this issue. I can't get a meeting with them and such. And the late, great Pat Leonard, Vice Chancellor for Student Affairs at UNC Wilmington, was in a meeting with her one time. And she had said that these people don't realize you're not going to get to the president until you get to me. Right? I mean, so you have to figure out who, as I went back to, I use the terms allies and champions, figuring out who they are so that when it comes time, and maybe the mover and the shaker is the VP for Student Affairs, ultimately the president, that you're going to get that audience with the president. Yeah, you have the ask in mind, but you're not leading with it. But let's continue the theme of being strategic. You better practice that. We do an exercise in some presentations that I do. We call it the prevention pitch to the president. And we do a kind of bit of role playing and such around what that might be like. And you need to figure that out before you go into that meeting. You get an audience with the president, a luxury might be 30 minutes. That might be the top. You need to figure out what your ask is. Don't lead with it. Figure out what your ask is going to be. But what's going to lead you to the ask? Be strategic and practice. Practice that speech. I know some folks have great relationships with their presidents and their chancellors. They'll call them up directly and bypass the hierarchy And you got to be ready for that sometimes too. Getting the president on your side, even if he or she is not going to be completely visible on this topic, again, having somebody who's at least your ally in this field is going to go a long way. So that's why that fourth strategy is get close to leadership, whatever that looks like.
And one little perspective I take on it is that, we know relationships are ever so important. They are what drive the work we do.
Mm-hmm.
But I like to just suggest to folks like, hey, when you go out and, you're trying to build a relationship with somebody, it can feel kind of wonky, kind of funny. And so I offer, like, what if you approach this relationship building with your goal being to build trust? Because at the core of any relationship is trust.
Mm-hmm.
You want that VP, that president to trust you, to know they can call on you, to know that, hey, you're bringing them good advice.
Mm-hmm.
And so if you seek to build trust with somebody, your approach to that might be a little bit different than just, hey, this is who I am. This is all about me. We should have a relationship.
Mm-hmm.
Instead of, hey, I want to show you that, you can trust me and build trust and foster trust.
No, and we know trust doesn't happen overnight, and yet trust can be broken in an instant. Correct. I mean, that it's interesting how that goes either way. Trust takes time, and broken trust can happen instantaneously. Going back to what you were just saying about the trust and such, I'm going to relate it to, the worst possible outcome in our field is a student death related to alcohol poisoning, a drug overdose, what have you. And it may not be the college president who gives you a phone call. It could be your VP for student affairs or your dean of students or whomever you're working for. But that phone call will be coming to your office. What are we doing around the drug problem on this campus? And that may be the first time any leadership is paying any attention to this. We know in our field, unfortunately, sometimes it takes a tragedy for attention to be placed on something. And so knowing your resources, knowing your strategic plan frontwards and backwards so that you can have that conversation and assure the leadership, again, whoever that might be, I don't want to presume it's the president, assure the leadership that we are doing everything that we can for a prevention-ready, prevention-heavy campus.
And that kind of reminds me of, I believe it was a presentation, but I saw the recording of it that you did on the 7 keys for success.
Mm-hmm.
And sort of following that theme of being strategic and trust taking time. One of the 7 keys that I remember was taking the long viewer. In my mind, it's, playing the long game in prevention, and prevention is about the long game or the long view. Can you kind of unpack that a little bit for us?
Yeah. So, and I still talk about those 7 keys to a successful program. I'm doing some presentations coming up over the next 2-3 months. And I talk about this. These 7 keys came out of the model programs when I was working at the U.S. Department of Education. And we're talking now 1999 through 2008. And this was specifically around 2002, 2003. We had that program to identify campuses who had exemplary or model programs. And over the 3-year period, we had identified we designated 23 campuses as exemplary or promising. We wanted to figure out, what did they all have in common? Because they were public, private, urban, rural, suburban, large, small. Interestingly enough, they were all 4 years. We didn't have any 2-year schools, and if we did, we had 1 among the mix. And there were these 7 core elements that came out of, that's what they all had in common. And I talk about them, even almost now 20 years later, because they're still relevant when I talk about these 7 keys. So The last one I talk about is taking the long view. It's an offshoot of the sixth one, which is sustainability. But taking the long view really is connected to there are no overnight successes in prevention. In prevention, it's a long-term situation, if you will. Our goals have to be long-term. We also have to have short-term and intermediate goals, but we're talking about changing behaviors over time. And so we know that changing the culture, there's that word again, changing that culture of drug use among college students is going to take time. There are no quick fixes. We know there are no magic formulas. If there were, this would have been solved by now, right? It's just, there's just a lot of hard work that's involved. And if you're looking for overnight success, you're probably not going to find it. And so when I talk about the long game or the long view, it's almost that I'll use the word end game in mind, but I don't want end to mean finite. I mean, we're never finished in this business. As much as we would like to work ourselves out of a job, it's likely not going to happen, right? We know drug use, no matter what the setting, is an age-old issue, and we will continue in our efforts to prevent it. But that's when I encourage people to take the long view. It's that, all right, Rich, I can take the long view, but what does that mean in my job every day? And
what do I do on a random Wednesday?
Yeah. So, you know, that to me goes back to prevention's not random. I will circle back to that quote. When I talk about this, I offer 3 pieces of advice. One is learn from other prevention professionals, whether that's in a conference, in a workshop, on a podcast, your coworkers, you know, grand rounds in your organization or what have you. We can and we do learn from each other. In fact, you know, our prevention efforts depend on it. So learning from each other, that's number 1. Number 2, ongoing training and technical assistance. That's critical. And as somebody who's worked with the former CAPT and who's somebody who's worked with PTTC and certainly with your own business now, that we know that training and technical assistance is absolutely critical to the work that we do. One thing that we learned out of the pandemic in that 2.5 years plus was there were a lot of low and no cost options that became available in terms of webinars and other professional development opportunities. So I always encourage people to do that. And the third piece of advice I give to people around taking the long view, acknowledge that there will be setbacks. And that is part of, you know, the process. That's where flexibility comes into play. Don't get me wrong, setbacks can be very discouraging. And I always say to folks, give yourself the space and grace of a pity party. That's totally okay to feel discouraged by a setback, but acknowledge that they're going to happen, regroup, and move on. So that's where taking the long view, that's the place I come from when I talk about that as one of the 7 keys to success.
And I love that you mentioned learning from podcasts, because I feel like that is still a growing space in our field, in that it's easily accessible. It's on demand. It's in your pocket when you're on a walk at the gym. And if you were to recommend listeners, viewers, recommend a podcast that they watch to learn from experts, current trends, you know, in addition to this one, of course, what one would you recommend?
Before I bring that up, I'm so glad you mentioned, you know, if you're at the gym, you're on a walk. The issue of self-care that has come up several times in recent meetings I've been in, I want to tie it also to the issue of prevention is often seen, I've often heard it referred to as touchy-feely and fluff. And the work that we are doing, whether it's preventing sexual assaults or preventing fights, preventing dropping out of school, preventing failing grades, the ultimate, right? Preventing a student death. None of that is touchy-feely. And our work should never be referred to. And so always push back on that. I always want people to push back on that. So because of the issues that we deal with and these, consequences and issues, it's important that we take care of ourselves. So whatever that hobby is for you, whatever it is that you do for self-care. So there are ways that you can, join the two. So listening to a podcast, there you go. There's your professional development while you're taking a walk or while you're at the gym. There's your self-care. There are ways that you can join the two. Now to your question. The Prevention Profiles Take 5 podcast series, we launched it in January of 2018, again, at the recommendation or suggestions from people in the field from around the country. That, again, a podcast specifically around prevention as it relates to preventing drug use on college campuses. I don't think it existed at the time. Now, I haven't done an inventory since, but there may be others out there. I'm sure that there are. But, I am really honored to be hosting that podcast as we entered our 18, 19, 20, 20, it's our 8th season. And it's hard, as trying to, we joked earlier before I came on camera about being, one-man production team. It's similar. I'm recruiting the guests, trying to figure out, where to slot them in. What are the questions that I'm going to ask them? All in the hopes, and here's where the end game comes into play. At the end of the day, I just want that 30 to 40 minutes. Sometimes I or guests get a little long-winded. I ultimately hope they come out of it with some takeaways, something that's going to help them do their job better or just support them in the work that they do. That's my end game with that particular podcast. So tune in.
And it is a great one. There'll be links in the show notes, y'all. Don't worry. Plenty of links. And as we're winding down our time, which kind of makes me a little sad here, it's fun having you on this side of the table instead of me being the guest. I can ask
a little
questions.
different. A little different.
But I want to just open it wide open. What have we not talked about that you want to be sure we touch on and share with our audience?
Since September of 2021, when we launched the One Pill Can Kill campaign, I want your viewers to become educated as much as they can, whether that's the beginning level, intermediate, advanced, on the dangers of fake pills and illicit fentanyl. As I said, I've been in this field 30 plus years. This is an issue unlike one we've never seen. And I have referred to fentanyl, illicit fentanyl and fake pills as the equal opportunity destroyer. It cuts across every race, every ethnic group. It doesn't matter if you're in the rural areas, suburban areas, urban areas. It doesn't matter wealthy or in poverty. It cuts across all settings, K-12, college, military, the workplace, older adults, midlife. It is unlike anything we have ever seen. And so I want people to really become educated on this very particular issue. DEA.gov/onepill. And I point people to the Partners Toolbox all the time. There you can get all the fact sheets, all the public safety alerts we've put out about this issue, all the different graphics and social media graphics. We intentionally did not brand any of that with DEA. I was lucky enough to be in a conversation with our administrator a couple weeks ago in an event. And I said, it's interesting that we don't really need to brand it, because One Pill Can Kill has become a brand, if you will, of its own. People kind of know where it's emanated out of. But intentionally, we don't brand it so people can tailor those resources locally. So that's the one thing we hadn't talked about was I want people to really become educated about fake pills, illicit fentanyl. The other thing that I want to, this is a little bit of a soapbox I'm going to get on, and I own it, and I don't apologize for it. I really hope the prevention professionals, whether they're working on campus or in the surrounding community, don't lose focus on the power of primary prevention. There are a significant number of students who come to campus who don't have alcohol or other drug issues. We know there are plenty that do, but let's say the large majority of students. But we also know coming to campus can be a risk factor in and of itself. You need to have the services in place to continue bolstering and supporting those students who have chosen not to use for whatever reason. And as I stay on the soapbox, I want to continue to push for comprehensive programs. We know that no one approach is the panacea that people might be looking for to help solve their issues on campus. We know through decades of prevention science that a comprehensive program is the best approach. So with that, I don't want people to think that only what we would say as selective interventions or indicated interventions or tertiary prevention or secondary prevention as though we need to focus on that, when universal and primary also have their place on the college campus. And so I would hope that people would continue to remember that. I hearken back to early on in my career working in New York State. I remember one of the deputy directors of the agency once said, if you presume that they will use alcohol or other drugs, then they will. And I really that always stuck with me, that quote. And I worry that presumptions like that are being made. I have heard it from leaders in agencies that I've worked for. I'm not going to name the leaders or the agencies, but that presumption has been made, and that totally puts us 10 steps behind. I think having those presumptions, am I naive to think that students aren't going to misuse alcohol and other drugs when they get to campus? Of course they are. And when I talk, harm reduction, that's the third rail issue sometimes. I always say that's a seismic shift for the federal government to be talking about harm reduction. I have been in that space my entire career because colleges and universities have worked in harm reduction the whole time. I say, look, our first and foremost message absolutely should be non-use, especially if you're under the age of 21 when it comes to alcohol. People say that's being a bit naive. No, it's not. It's the law. But for those students who choose to ignore the law, then obviously you need to have strategies and programs in place. So my hope, I'll say it's advice, but my hope is that folks who are working in this space don't forego primary prevention. Has its place along with every other strategy you're working on campus. Just learn as much as you can about what's going on with fake pills and illicit fentanyl, because it's widespread and it's unlike anything we've ever seen.
Wonderful wisdom. And folks, I'll drop a link to a past episode where I had Kate Lower from UT Austin on talking about the work they're doing there on campus with the shift makers and really amplifying the students' voices that choose not to use substances, and actually in the planning to have them come back on and bring some of the student shift makers as well to share their experiences. Stay tuned for that. I'm excited. Yes, indeed. And I could ask you questions for hours and days. And I think, though, I have homework to do. My homework is go through this episode recording and create an actual list of all the different topics we said, that would be a podcast. That should be a podcast.
Yeah.
We'll have a whole nother list of episodes we're going to do. But yes, alas, our time has come for now.
Yeah.
So I can't help but thank you for for creating such positive change. And one of the things that I love and respect that you and your team at DEA have done and are doing oh so well is listening and responding, actually taking what you hear and doing something with it. That is really just cool. So thank you to you and the entire team there for doing that and helping empower us prevention leaders.
I've been blessed my career. Obviously, I talked a little bit about Fran. If I didn't mention her by name, Fran Harding was my mentor, continues to be. She always likes to say that I took the program she created in New York and advanced it to where it needed to be. And then here at DEA, it's nice to have the flexibility, and Sean, when he recruited me, has given me a pretty, carte blanche. It's not absolutely everything. I've asked for things I don't get, but I've had about as long a leash, I think, that anybody could possibly have, which really it's so freeing. But to your point, as I said, I don't work on a campus. I have to rely on the people that do. We might have the resources that people don't. And so we can create what people need. So yeah, listening and producing. Maybe that's a title of an episode coming up soon. Or that's a t-shirt. I don't know. Listen and produce.
Yes. Prevention professional / listener / producer. Yes. Long story short, folks, check the show notes for all kinds of links. Going to drop links to the podcast, the campusdrugprevention.gov website, and the practitioner's toolbox, Prevention with Purpose, and One Pill Can Kill. Tons of resources in the show notes. Thank you all for listening and watching. And thank you again, Rich, and to your team behind the scenes that helped make this come together. Thank you all. Keep rocking. That concludes this episode. Thanks for tuning in. Be sure to hit the subscribe button and share this episode with a friend before you leave. And we look forward to seeing you on social media because prevention is better together. Together, we are stronger.